runs. Okay. Now, what I've neglected to mention, but those kinds of things which are given to you through speech, not rongo, which is writing, perhaps. Okay. They think it's writing, and they've translated 10%, so it must be some kind of writing. But when you have no writing and you receive something from stories around the campfire, or somebody tells you a story, or sings you a lullaby, or reads you, well, doesn't read you, but tells you a nursery rhyme, that's called the oral tradition, which is on the blackboard. I forgot to mention that, but that was too bad because, you know, one of the questions I think asks you, from what part of the oral tradition was evidence taken that showed that Easter Island had the Easter Island's original language was based on blank, the blank language. Okay, so that's the form. That's the question. And it's on the board. Okay, so stated, you're caught up with section 7. You got that version. Now we're into biological anthropology and physical anthropology, right?
Yeah.
Correct. So biological anthropology is the new improved name because, of course, now we are using genetic material. We are doing all kinds of genetic testing, and we are tracing through genetic material migrations that we used to trace through linguistic evidence, all kinds of things. We can tell from your genetics who your ancestors were and what groups were in contact with each other. Well, contact in the sense that they interbred. You may have contacted some groups that you didn't get, your ancestors didn't think were cute, so you know, you never decided to, your ancestors never decided to interbreed with them. But we know the ones that you bred with, and that allows us much more specifically to chart, for instance, migrations of people going back 10, 20, 30, 40, 100,000 plus years, okay? Like deep time. And so if you go to get your DNA done, did I ask this class whether they've done it yet for 99 bucks or whatever it is? You really should do it because it tells you all kinds of things about yourself, which there may be some future medical problems that you have that you are totally unaware of because they haven't cropped up yet. And you should know those things, what you are prone to have because of your genetics. And they don't sell it as a, I mean, in fact, the American Medical Association does not like it when they tell people that, because of course that's what doctors do, right? And of course the DNA may never kick in. What's interesting now is what triggers what DNA in animals and human beings and life forms. And you'll have some people that have certain clear markers of things that should pop up as they go along, and it's never triggered. Or what we're looking for is the triggers that we can turn off for cancer and all kinds of things. We may be solving diseases and who knows what by turning off triggers in addition to turning on triggers. What makes them kick in? Okay? And so I would, if I was you, I'd go, it should be interesting to you because you may sit there in total ignorance your whole life and then find that you have something that you could have worked towards avoiding. Okay? And of course, there's the extreme example of that, and I'm not advocating it, but certainly when Angela Jolie, her mother and many women in her family died of breast cancer. And so she did it, what's that called when you do it ahead of time? Mastectomy. There we go. So it's kind of interesting if all those things are out there and we don't access the information. I guess some people don't want to know what's in the future. Ignorance is bliss, but medically speaking, I think it's probably wise to do that, because then you can avoid all kinds of things that will put you in a situation where that may occur to you. Okay. And there was an article in the newspaper this weekend about being overweight, and how, in fact, some anthropologists are arguing that that's actually the future evolution, to overweight. It's not just a question of having too much in the way of carbohydrates and sugars available in the diet, but that in fact we are actually moving to a more overweight is assuming there's an exact weight. We are beginning to tend to get heavier as time goes on, and that may be something that's genetic also, with mutations occurring and so on and so forth. Anyway. I mean, I've known people that they dieted, they did every bloody thing they could possibly do, they barely ate a thing and they still put on weight. And we all know people who are really annoying, they can eat anything, I swear to God, eat anything, and they still are skinny as rails. My magic moment came when I got my tonsils out at 18, and I've always been as skinny as a rail, and then bang, everything I ate suddenly was on my body, which was kind of interesting, because if you're not accustomed to that, you have to change your whole, well, you can't even change your eating habits. What you have to do is you have to get more active and other things. And of course, that's what we know about our bodies, is that we are actually hunters and gatherers. You are designed to travel over big distances, not particularly fast, but consistently in the heat. That's why you have no body hair. You sweat off the heat. And so, your ancestors in Africa traveled over the savannah long, long distances, searching for opportunities of getting food, usually scavenging food, not hunting food. When you look at the animal world, you find that the bright animals are the scavengers, the ones that have to avoid the real predators and live off the kills of others. Actually, there are very few pure predators in the world. Very few. Most animals would rather steal food from some other animal that killed it than actually killed themselves, because every predator could get injured in the kill. And there's this beautiful videotape I have where some wild dogs in Africa have killed something, and they've got about 2 minutes to eat it, because everything around, once the buzzards get overhead, everything around is coming towards them to get a piece of the action, right? And of course, this big male lion shows up, and you should have heard those dogs just, I don't know what they were saying in Wild Dog, but it wasn't nice. But they got out of the way. They were real, so you bloody lion, work for a living, Anyway, so you are designed to be hunters and gatherers and travel long distance. It has been described as, in addition to, we were first of all scavengers, and then we became what's called, I'm going to have to look it up, it begins with P. I can't remember if it's perseverance hunters. That's where you wound something, or you hit something with a poison arrow or dart, and then it runs off happily away from you, because it can run really fast, and then you encountered it as it's dying 2 days later. You have to stay on the road, keep on coming, because of course if you don't, some other animal will get the prey, and you don't, it's not that, we have this incredible, ridiculous view of humans standing up in front of large animals and killing them mano a mano, a la Hemingway or something, and in fact, it's not that macho. It's sort of, we are what we are because we are just so damn persistent. And we could follow creatures over a long distance, faster creatures, more dangerous creatures, once we wounded them, because of course we don't heat up. And so while all other predators and scavengers are sleeping, somewhere where they can find shade in the afternoon in the African sun, we'd be out there chugging along, okay, in pursuit of something. And apparently it made us highly successful both as scavengers and later as hunters, and that's why you've got that very peculiar body. It's designed, in one sense, for climbing trees. All those parts, most of those parts you have are arboreal. Your visions for living in the trees and judging between depth perception between branches. But at one point, our ancestors got too big to stay up in the trees. If you see the evolution of primates, we start off with smaller primates who go up into the trees, then we begin to get bigger and bigger, and then we come down from the trees. And once we developed our new bipedal walking upright, we were able to actually even adapt better to the ground again. So you're sort of an arboreal creature that actually uses those skills on the ground. I remember being outside my son's elementary school, and it was that magic time when the graduation school dance was going to happen. And so the 12-year-old, 13-year-old girls had to somehow get out of that scruffy lot of undersized, just through puberty, young boys, who, do not look like the romantic leads of anybody's play. And they were sniffing around the boys to find out if one or, oh, so-and-so plays the drums. Well, that's kind of cool. Oh, so-and-so skis. Well, that, And so they were after these little guys. The girls were huge. I mean, they're 12-year-old girls, fairly advanced. A 12-year-old boy in most cases, God, too small, throw them back. So they were out trying to find a date to the prom, right? And it was really interesting. The girls were on the ground, and there was this one little tree in the park, right beside the school, and the boys were all in the tree. The girls had treed the boys. The reason it was called physical, because we use physical parts to identify things, not DNA. So for instance, when Easter Island, when we got the linguistic evidence on Easter Island that clearly the people on Easter Island who were first there originated in a certain language group, then we went to the physical anthropology evidence, and they dug up graves, and they did all kinds of things, and they found that the skulls of the earliest Easter Islanders were very similar. The skull type were very similar to other Polynesian groups. They compared them to the South American Indians, which of course was what was the original idea, and they found that one had a rocking chin, the other didn't have a rocking chin, one had this, one had that. And so when they were doing that, they were practicing physical anthropology. You can look at groups, they have certain physically typical developments that have mutated into existence. American Indian tends to have something, Polynesians tend to have something, and South American Incas tend to have something, and there's some, it shows relation and not relation, and there's all kinds of small things that people have, hair type and so on and so forth, which can identify them as being part of one group or another group, okay? And so physical anthropology was very much interested in that, and then we upped the ante and made it biological anthropology when we began to use DNA evidence. That's just, you just get a swath and you can tell exactly what groups are related to whom, and so on and so forth. And you can tell when they broke up, when they migrated from each other, and so on and so forth. And of course that makes things very, my favorite one is this. And no, if somebody had told me through genetic evidence that we were going to come up, and we're going to get all kinds of this. Apparently at one time in Siberia, okay, in the corner of Siberia that faces what is now Alaska, there was a group of modern humans. They must have broken into two. One group went across the land bridge into Alaska and spread out in North America, becoming the ancestors of the American Indians, at least one wave of the ancestors of American Indians. So their descendants are today the Cree and the Ojibwa in eastern Canada. The other group went back towards the east from Siberia and settled in a place called today Greece. So if you'd have told me that Cree Indians and Greeks share genetic markers that show that they are related and descended from one another, I would have said, a common ancestor, I would have said, no way, no way. And so it's very interesting. We're going to find out a lot of things about our ancestry, which are going to turn every idea on its head. And of course, during the Nazi period in Nazi Germany, they were very big and racist and physical evidence to prove superiority of one group over the other. And of course, today we actually have the tools to tell the relations. And we're going to find that a lot of groups that think each other, one group is inferior to the other and they're fighting wars, I'm superior to you, they're actually probably related. So it's like they're cousins fighting each other rather than completely different groups fighting each other. And we also find that there is a huge amount of mixture in the human gene pool. So that this idea of, races, even races it's a social concept. You can't really break up the human species at any place. There's a flow of genetic material that doesn't make it possible to say this is one group and that's another group. And what we do is we pick up, when it was done on a physical examination, they pick up one trait which they liked, or whoever the person was liked this group to be whatever, and that group to be whatever. And as it turns out, it doesn't work that way at all. So the concept of race is out. I find it really quite strange. It's been out for like 50 years, and every now and then I'll see it in some article in the newspaper, like, God, where did they get that? But in many places in the world, it's still around for political reasons. And we are all descended from the earliest modern human, which came into existence, mutated into existence in Africa. Okay, so and we may have some DNA from Neanderthals. If we did come out of Africa, it's likely that anybody that's got any DNA from Neanderthals, which are not directly in our line, by the way, they picked it up because somebody interbreeded with Neanderthals once they left Africa. And so it's really quite interesting. When you look at life itself, it's all related to each other. We all descend from the same little microbes that started life. And in fact, it's like, what is it? The tree of life is not a tree. It's I don't know. That sounds too plant-like. But we are all descended. And this shows you how amazing mutation is. You're all... Well, some of you are teenage, but you're teenage, not ninja humans. You are. Mutation is exactly what created you. And there are members of the modern Homo sapiens species which do have new mutations, which are different than the ones that existed in the species at 200,000 years ago. And the example, of course, that everybody brings out is high in the Himalayas. There are groups of people that can breathe air and exist at an altitude that none of you could. And they have no problem whatsoever. And if you went up there and wandered around, you'd get sick as a dog and probably have to leave. So they've developed all kinds of ways to handle that. And if that's true, then all over the world with the different environments, there must be all kinds of diversity, because mutations are occurring all the time. Okay? And sometimes the mutation means survival, which means it usually stays in the genetic pool and gets passed on. Sometimes it means nothing. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to save you. So it may stay in because it's not going to kill you. And then sometimes it's going to kill you, sure. Okay? And that's why when we have hospitals, they call them birth defects. They're not birth defects, they're mutations. And if you're not born with with a heart valve, you've got to get it replaced, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And it's normal. It's just normal that mutations occur all the time. And so you are X people. That's true. It is X people. And every animal and every life form out there is X people. You don't need an atomic bomb to force you to mutate, although the rate can go up with atomic weapons. All right. Now, this leads us to, we've done archaeology, and a field that links biological anthropology and archaeology is paleoanthropology. This is the study of our ancestors particularly, and the main group is what we call hominids. Now, to be tricky, and just show you how different language groups can really screw up everything and give you too much work to do. These can be called hominins without the ID. You can get rid of the ID, you'll see it in that form. Hominins, you'll see it with an ES, sometimes when it comes out of a French background. And so there's hominins, there's hominin. So, we use this one in this course only because that's the first one I learned. But these others have been used. It's because the standard name, hominidae, can be changed into any form depending on your language. So just remember that if you see this or this, it's actually this too. This is the one we're going to use, but I'm not going to penalize anybody if they don't. It's like the spelling of archaeology. There's a variation. Okay. Now hominids, the big mistake when we think of our ancestors is we think there are only a few of them. We think that hominids mutated from a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos from 5 to 8 million years ago in Africa. Million years ago. So MYA in paleoanthropology speak. We don't use before Christ, any of those forms anymore. They're kind of, the problem with BC is it's so recent. I mean, once you start studying our ancestors, the dates that are used to study things like the Bible and what we used to think was old, something about the ancient Egyptians, hieroglyph, they're so recent, it doesn't make any sense anymore. So maybe you'll see that in Bible studies, maybe you'll see that in history courses, but when we get into paleoanthropology, we're dealing with such big time spans that when you say 2 million years is a birth in evolution, okay? Just a little bit of time, and we think that somebody born at the time of Christ is really long way back, not really. Okay. So 5 to 8 million years ago, there were mutations that meant that some pongid, which means 8, that's the 8 family, okay, had mutated to what we call a hominid. The earliest hominid. We haven't found it yet. We don't know. We're looking. Every year every couple of years they find an earlier hominid than the last one. At the moment there are 4 in running to be earliest hominid. I don't agree with who they've chosen. Because I think it's political why they won't accept the one that's earlier. But it usually depends on how much evidence, you know, if you only find several bones that define hominid, and you find a lot of other bones that define hominid or DNA material, you're more likely to say that one has good evidence, that one doesn't have good evidence, this is the earliest one. And there's other things that do occur, which when we get to the discussion of paleoanthropology later on, it really is who does their homework and who's willing to put in enough effort. They can get their particular hominid recognized as the earliest one in some very interesting ways, okay, which are very clever. In any case, between 5 and 8 million years ago, we get the mutation to hominids. The earliest hominid we now accept in Africa is at 4.4 million years ago. So you can see that it is highly likely that there's going to be an earlier one, because that's not even in the range for 5 to 8 million years ago that we know genetically should be the case. Okay? Now, the tricky bit is what defines a hominid. And what defines a hominid is being habitually, that means most often habitually, bipedal. Most people who don't know anything about paleoanthropology will think that what we're looking for is a creature with a brain larger than an ape. In actuality, we're not. We're looking for an ape that stood up and walked around on 2 legs habitually, most of the time. All apes are quadrupeds. Quadrupeds. They knuckle walk. In most cases, they need all 4s when they're traveling for speed. They can stand up. They can stand up, but they are not habitually standing. I mean, when you were a little kid, you like to get down on your legs, but, you know, moving around playing with the dog on the grass, you realize how inefficient you are compared to the dog, which is a quadruped. However, when you get up on your hind legs, you are much more efficient at moving. And of course, we're beginning to, we now think that that upright stance, which is only typical of hominids amongst primates, okay, it's a primate adaptation that we only find with our direct ancestors, is probably the result of our abilities in the trees. Because when you think of being in the trees, you have to use your hands to grab branches. You have to balance a tremendous amount, and we probably were, when the mutation occurred, it really helped us to move around in the trees. Quadrupeds have 4 legs they have to somehow climb trees with. It's much easier to balance on a branch with your hands out like this and hold things than it is to walk with 4 legs, which always have to find a place to, you know, land. And so we are pretty sure that we got bipedal before we came down to the ground, and that we found being bipedal was extremely a good adaptation to living in flat grasslands where there were groupings of trees that we could climb up if we got into trouble. Because we weren't very formidable. We were about 3 to 4 feet tall, not very muscular, not very big. Our one talent that may have been formidable, other than making noise, like other primates, is the way our arm is shaped. Okay, when you see a baseball pitcher or a quarterback throw a ball, this is probably something only we can do. We can throw something with accuracy and velocity and hit a target or get close to it. And one of the reasons we were probably able to survive, although we'll never get any evidence of this, is that we were able to chuck stuff at predators and drive them off. You can imagine a predator coming on to what they think is an easy meal, and then all of a sudden the sky starts raining rocks and sticks. Certainly chimpanzees throw things, but they can only throw underhand. We can throw overhand and hit things at a distance. And so that probably was a survival-worthy trait. And the other one may have been that when we lost our body hair and we're traveling around in the heat looking for food, usually things to scavenge, one of the theories is we stunk like hell. That when we sweated and had no body hair, we probably were the equivalent of a primate skunk, and that we were not the preferred thing to eat. We were the stinky thing. You know. The lions, two lions sitting there. Oh, Fred, what? Oh, God, get away from me! What did you eat last night? I know. Got excited, saw something moving, and I ate one of those damn hominids. Jesus, I can't get it out of my mouth. What a... Okay, so we probably are a little less appetizing to the next thing. Although, once, you know, predators get a taste for our population, they certainly find us easy to pick off. Tigers, you got to watch tigers in India, because once they've had success with humans, they tend to follow human population and catch the weak. So, but that's because other things have disappeared. So, we are habitually bipedal. The other primates are quadrupeds. And that's what defines a hominid. So, the holy grail, the greatest thing that you can do in paleoanthropology is find the earliest hominid so far found. It makes your career instantly. And the archaeologists, paleoanthropologists that did this, of course, became, you know, so like famous in National Geographic and therefore the world. And it's quite interesting. It is this funny, you know, you think, they find lots of hominids, they find lots of things, but if you find the earliest, somehow that's just a step above. Okay. And each couple of decades we get a new earliest and a new group of hominid finders that suddenly increase in status. Every time they have a DVD or a videotape, they always ask these people as the experts what they think about something, and so on and so forth. And of course, even better, once you've established your career like that, grant-giving institutions give you all kinds of money to do anything you want, and you can make the careers of other people by getting them funding to go out and archaeology digs and so on and so forth. So it really is this kind of odd star system that is really quite bizarre. The Louis Leakey found some of the earliest hominids first at Olduvai Gorge. He was then able to get money from National Geographic to send out a whole bunch of people to look for more. And Olduvai Gorge. Okay. He sent out the first primatologist, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey. He started the field of primatology with money he had to burn because he had the reputation of finding the earliest hominid and so on and so forth. So there's an example. The current place, which is the center of paleoanthropology, is in East Africa, mostly. Did I explain why? Yes. The three conditions in East Africa? Okay. And even though other places in Africa probably have as early hominids under the ground, this is the place where you can find them most easily and where they're likely to be near the surface. So most of the paleoanthropologists go there. There are massively huge universities in the region, in Kenya, Ethiopia, countries that you usually consider to be poor countries, based on the fact that huge collections of finds have been kept there. Okay, in the olden days, the Europeans used to come in, take these things and ship them off to Europe, you know, and just walk out with them. Nowadays, countries are much more sophisticated about where those things go, and they should stay in the region. So there's some really amazing university departments in the area which are based on the fact that that's where they find these things. And the average person out in the countryside is more sophisticated, or as sophisticated as any paleoanthropologist in finding these, because every day they probably walk quite near to early fossils. They live in the midst of them, so they have become very good at, you know, you probably take it to the person in the village, he'll say, well, no, that's not old, you know, he'll give you a rundown, and he doesn't even have any degrees, he's just worked on several digs. Okay? So paleoanthropology is really quite interesting, and it's an offshoot of biological anthropology. Another offshoot, which came out of archaeology and biological anthropology, is forensic anthropology. Did I discuss this? Okay, and as did I discuss it? Okay, well, I sometimes get students who want to take anthropology so they can learn forensic anthropology and write books like Kathy Reichs, who teaches at McGill. I'm not sure she's still there. But she was a anthropologist, doctor, lab person who did forensic anthropology. What she would do was she'd look at some kind of remain of a human. She'd be able to tell all kinds of things about the human just by doing tests and knowing what she did about fossils. Okay? So it really is something that came out of archaeology and paleoanthropology, this skill to identify cause of death, health, age, and then once they've done that, now in the old days they used to use sculptors to come in and rebuild the bones around the skull and everything like that to find out what the person looked like. Nowadays we use computers to rebuild the face and so on and so forth. And so obviously this was a skill that police departments, which were arriving at legal cases for murder, for just, you know, death by accident or death that wasn't, all these issues that were around, they'd find a body that was terribly decomposed or destroyed or only a few pieces left, and they'd take it to the local university and find the paleoanthropologist or archaeologist or biological anthropologist that did the work at that school. And so this was the beginning of CSI. Okay? And Reichs, Kathy Reichs, which I think she's down here on this sheet, started writing novels, what, 10, 20 years ago, based on forensic evidence, very much like Sherlock Holmes in a way. She'd set up the novel with the forensic evidence being discovered, which would eliminate certain people as the killer or not killer, or whether it died a violent death or so on and so forth. And she became quite popular. I've never read one of her novels. Somebody told me she doesn't write that well, but the forensics is very interesting. But every now and then I get a student who takes anthropology course because they want to get into forensic science and then become a writer. So it's sort of like they want to follow the whole pattern that Kathy makes, and of course she's quite famous. And the series Bones, are you familiar? She's based, the female character who's the head forensic scientist in the Bones theory is based on Kathy Reich's character, on her. Okay? I have at least one student, we don't do archaeology here. We don't do forensic science. We lecture on biological anthropology, and we do a course called Human Evolution, which deals with this material and the evidence for it. And so I've had several students who have come through that have gone on. They've gone to university, they've taken anthropology, but they've also taken a lot of biology courses so that they could become forensic scientists. And the current one is at Vanderbilt, University of Vanderbilt, which is named after one of the it's in the southern United States, I don't know where it is. And every time now and then I hear from her, and she's doing quite well. So if you are intending to become a forensic scientist, you probably are going to have to specialize a little more in biology and physical science, in addition to anthropology, and then you can decide whether you want to write novels also. I don't know. I have a colleague who retired, now he's writing poetry. I never knew he had that urge. He's very happy. I have no idea why, but all those years he had that urge to write poetry. It just didn't happen. Anyway, so you could do that. So paleoanthropology, biological anthropology, archaeology are all linked together. It has been said of biological anthropology is that it is the only field that does not concern itself with cultural things. That's not true, I don't think. I think very often cultural things come into play when you do biological anthropology. Did I tell you the example about the big wrist? Okay? They dug up some bodies in Britain on a battlefield which had been executed, and all the people who'd been executed had these massively large, one wrist, not two, one wrist, massively large, and they were able to tell that those were all bowmen, and they had been executed because these were the most dangerous men on the field to the guys wearing armor. And so there's an example of physical anthropology actually telling you something cultural, if not historical. So I think that all these things have some kind of linkage, but this is supposed to be purely without cultural implication, but of course it does. Culture creeps in all over the place. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the last one, the one that is what most of the teachers at teaching at Dawson College would see themselves as representatives or interested in this field. We've all been trained in it. Most of us have done research in it. And I would say it's the most common form of anthropologist, not that we're common, but I guess we are, that exists. And this is cultural anthropology. Cultural. Cultural deals with human behavior, what people do, what they say, how they say it, what types of societies they're in, what their religions are, why they recognize a certain type of family structure when other people recognize other family structures. Okay? And I would argue, if you want to understand why people do things, you better know this stuff because you may be missing something that's obvious. Hunters and gatherers tend to behave culturally differently than other types of societies because in the process of developing certain attitudes and psychologies and religions that all have to do with what hunting and gathering, they become personalities that are different. They look at the world differently than agriculturalists and industrial people and so on and so forth. And so it really is this interesting thing where you can predict things about people. If you give them a profile of what they do, whether hunters, gatherers, or agriculturalists, you can predict certain things about them on the basis of all the things that you put together as characteristics. You can predict behavior. Okay? And I think this is why anthropology has become more and more prevalent recently, is that we're beginning to realize that the rest of the world, you know, we're just one or two cultures, North America, whatever you want to describe us as, in the midst of many, many cultures. And even though there's an industrialized capitalist culture in the world, a lot of people do things for reasons that are not necessarily clear to people who see themselves as having those kinds of views from that type of world. And different values in different cultures for family and so on and so forth, and for religion and all those things. Honor, what males do, what males are supposed to do if they are real men, what women are supposed to do. All those things differ between societies based on what type of society it is and what kind of values and the history it's had. And so we think that everybody behaves the way that we do with the same values. And it just ain't so. Why people will and will not do things, it just ain't so. And of course, the American government recognized this during World War II. They had been attacked by the Japanese. Well, they deserved to be attacked, actually, at Pearl Harbor, because they did exactly, if they'd have done their study beforehand, they'd have realized they were doing exactly what would make the Japanese attack them. You know, if they'd have done their anthropology earlier, they would have realized if we do this, they'll attack us. Okay? Because the Japanese saw what they did, which is cut off oil to Japan. The Americans cut off oil, an embargo against Japan, and without the oil, the Japanese army and navy could not run. So the Japanese saw that as a provocation for war and attacked Pearl Harbor. And then the Americans got smart. This is when anthropology, in the modern sense, was in its infancy. They went out and got themselves an anthropologist who was an expert on Japanese culture, so that they would know what the Japanese would do in which situation. Okay? They finally figured it out. If we're going to fight these guys, we better know what their values are. We better know why they do what they do, because we missed it at the beginning. We thought we'd stop their expansion in the Pacific by cutting off oil. All we did was get ourselves knocked out of Pearl Harbor. And so, it's out there. They're using, I would bet you most major corporations entail somebody with an anthropological degree or some kind of thing to go into markets where they don't know why people buy things and do. Okay? And it's not just a case of doing statistical studies, it's values. You have a whole bunch of things that people miss about societies. My favorite example is I had a student whose younger brother was getting married to a Japanese woman in Japan. He and his other brother were able to go, and he got up to make the speech for his family at the banquet where they were going to get married, and he insulted everybody instantly. The whole family, he insulted everybody and the whole other Japanese family that was in the room. And the reason he did this is because it's the oldest son still alive that makes the speech. And he wasn't the oldest son still alive because the oldest son still alive didn't come. Therefore, it was a huge insult to the family that his brother was moving into. Of course, none of them knew this. Okay, and he said, boy, that went over well. I think they got divorced quite shortly after because of the whatever. But so you have to know these things in the world today, because you can constantly. I tell my students, you get off the plane in Japan, you'll have insulted 5 people by the time you pick up your luggage. 5 people at least, without even knowing it. Okay, and so we don't see these things about culture, although. If you're on a bus or a metro and somebody does something, you just sit there and you go, oh, that's so rude. God, that's so rude. really, you know, because you've got your values, and that's not the way to treat somebody in your cultural view of the world, okay? So cultural anthropologists are probably more numerous than any other kind, because there's a lot of cultures out there, and there's been a lot of history of studying other people's. Probably when there were two societies in the world, you know, somebody and their neighbors, that invented the first cultural anthropologists, because they had to understand the other. Most people are not behaving the same way we are. How come? Shouldn't they behave the same? And so, from the beginning, people have been practicing cultural anthropology, okay? In Britain, it's called social anthropology. Probably in each country in the world, it's called something else. In North America and the United States, we call it cultural anthropology. Or there's another phrase that sometimes is used, socio-cultural anthropology. But I think by far the most likely one in North America, Anglo-North America, is cultural anthropology. Okay. Now, this is a social science that probably was all of social science at one time, but for political reasons, which are too numerous to go into, it now is seen as something separate from economics, from sociology, from history. But there's one thing that it is, it's holistic, which means it uses everything in the explanation. If you are a cultural anthropologist, there is nothing you do not study to get the explanation. You start off by looking at whatever subsistence system the people are using, and the mix of the subsistence system, what they do for a living. Then you look at what types of social structures and political structures they make. You early?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this your other class?
Yeah.
Very bad.
Political structure. Is it a quarter after we go? Yeah. Anyway, social and political structure. And then there's ideologies, religion, political. So these are all the things you study. You study everything in the kitchen sink to understand how mixtures of the ideas and the needs within a culture produce the behaviors. What behaviors are acceptable? What behaviors are likely? And you look at the difference between the stated behaviors, what people say they do, and what they actually do. Okay? You may find that they say we only marry people in a certain group or have sexual relations with people in a certain group. There'll be what's called an incest taboo. There'll be people they do not have sexual relationships with. Taboo is a Polynesian word meaning you don't do it. And then when you study them, you realize, that's what they say they shouldn't do. Okay? You shouldn't have a tryst with a cousin or a second cousin or somebody from that village because of some political reason. But then you find out, oh yeah, it's going on. But, you know, it's sort of like this taboo thing that nobody admits to, unless you sit down and somebody says, well, you know, I used to go out with a girl from that village, you know, that was great, and what do you do about it, and so on. And so, it's what people say they do isn't always what they do. Why they say they do it isn't always the real reason. So you have to dig deep and weigh all the possibilities before you begin to come up with things that are more likely than usually what people say about themselves. People will give you, their culture has ideal values that everybody has been taught that they should be moving towards, you know? And these ideal values are not always why people are doing things. You know yourself that very often you'll say, I'm doing this for a reason, but you're actually doing it for some other reason. You know? So on and so forth. And so, anthropologists have a very difficult job, and they have to consider a lot. And they have to know all these things. So they have to study everything and the kitchen sink. So they study the history of the thing, they study the politics of the thing, they study the economics of the thing, they study the psychology of the thing, they study the sexuality of the thing. You go on and on and on, and that means that they look at everything from every point of view, a holistic explanation. They may look at the geology when for a long time it was considered in poor form because everybody was in love with the Mayans and their temples. It was poor form to suggest that something had happened for a certain reason. So when the Mayan civilization fell and collapsed, it had to be an intricate, just so romantic reason that it collapsed. And now we're looking at it, and it's beginning to realize that it was climate change, massive climate change. 100-year drought destroyed the Maya civilization. When we look at, there's a mystery amongst the ancient Egyptians. The ancient old kingdom was doing quite well, pyramids being built, and all of a sudden, massive society falling apart. And, you know, all kinds of invading peoples, disease, and so on and so forth. Poor rulers, you know, the usual thing that we all think of. And then once again, they found out that the same reason had come into effect. There was a massive eruption in a part of the world that blanketed the Egyptian area with darkness and the inability to grow things because they just weren't getting sunlight. So crops were not coming out for a long period of time. It was actually Vesuvius, by the way. It was the one that then exploded in Roman times. This was about 400 BC the first time. And so we begin to find that a lot of things can be geology, they can be climate. And so when you do these things, it's amazing where you're going to call upon information. Just as an archaeologist is the person bringing together many experts, experts in dating, experts in finding things, experts in the Earth's crust, experts in weather, an anthropologist has to look at the totality of the evidence in most cases, not just the psychological reason, but the psychological reason, not just the political, not just the social structure. And so it becomes quite complex, and actually it really is interesting, because you begin to see things in your own life and realize the myriad of things that actually affect what you do when you think it's only a few things. And you also think in your life that you are oh so in control. Okay, and of course, you know, once I'm sure a lot of people felt in control when the bank collapse happened in the United States government, and they all lost their jobs and their housing and everything like that, you know. And so it's interesting, these things all have connections. So cultural anthropology is something that everybody is in one sense.